Hello, everyone. I'm Vanessa Tinker, and I'm a lecturer at Clegg Civitas, and I'm also an analyst for the Opportunity Institute for Foreign Affairs. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing Sergej Sumlenny, who is the founder of European Resilience Initiative Center. Previously, he was the director for Heinrich Bolt Foundation office in Kyiv from 2015 to 2021. He was responsible for the foundation's work in Ukraine and Belarus. He holds a PhD in democratic development and post-totalitarian governments. His current research focuses on security and energy issues in Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. So hello, Sergej. Thank you again for agreeing to join me today to discuss your current research and your cooperation with the 3Cs Initiative.
Yeah, hello, Vanessa. Thank you for having invited me today. It's a pleasure.
So I would like to begin by discussing your research on EU and NATO perspectives on the current situation in Ukraine and possibly how it's changed since the Russian-Ukrainian war began.
Well, we can look at this situation in a perspective, and we know that NATO had different ideas inside of the alliance. Like different countries had different ideas what they should do. What is the purpose of NATO? Is NATO outdated? Do we need NATO anymore? And look, like the Eastern allies of the NATO, the Baltic countries, the Central European countries like Poland, Czechia, or Slovakia, all the other countries, they told all the time that we need stronger NATO, we need more investment into military infrastructure, into equipment, into army training, because we have a threat in Europe, and this is a threat called Russia. Like, it's not about being responsible for global maritime logistics or for some other things which are indeed very important. But NATO was created not for keeping sea routes safe, like somewhere in Atlantic or in Mediterranean. No, it was created for keeping the threat of the war in Europe limited and being able to defend Europe against the Russian threat. And now this purpose re-emerged in all the reality, like more realistic than anyone wished, but it re-emerged. And NATO has its purpose once again. And, I may repeat it, right?
That's fine.
Yeah. So now this threat is now this threat has reemerged once again. It's reemerged more realistic in a more realistic way than anyone wished, but it is here. We have this war in Europe, and it is war started by Russia against the collective West, not only against Ukraine. And we have the purpose for NATO once again. And you know that joke, of course, that Vladimir Putin should be called a salesman of the year in NATO because he has persuaded to join NATO two countries which maintained their neutrality for decades, and Sweden, for example, for hundreds of years. And this is what happened. Like, Finland didn't expect to be allied with any military alliance, even during the Soviet Union. And now Helsinki obviously sees Russia as a bigger threat to its independence than the Soviet Union in after World War II time. That is what we need to understand. That is what the elites in Berlin and in Paris need to understand that these countries, they really see their independence, security, and safety being threatened by Russia, and they see only NATO as the effective tool to provide them with the necessary level of security.
Absolutely. And that actually leads to my next question about Finland. So how, if anything, has the accession of Finland into NATO changed the security situation and the Russian-Ukrainian war?
Well, from the first side, it doesn't change the situation on the war field at all. Because, of course, we can make jokes that after the accession of Finland into NATO, the NATO-Russia land border has doubled, like increased by 1,500 kilometers. And that is what Vladimir Putin feared. But in reality, it's not what Vladimir Putin feared, because no one can seriously say that Vladimir Putin believed that NATO has plans to attack Russia.
Right.
So for Vladimir Putin, NATO has never been a threat which can attack Russia. NATO was, of course, a competitor and an enemy, but it was an enemy in quite different way of thinking. Like Vladimir Putin saw NATO as an enemy from the perspective that accession to NATO makes countries more safe and independent. And Vladimir Putin didn't want to see his neighbors safe and independent. He wanted to see his neighbors threatened and dependent from Moscow. That is why when the Baltic states joined NATO, the level of Russian interference, or the scale of Russian interference and of Russian blackmailing, has decreased. Of course, Russia could start to spy protests, ignite protests, and attack Estonian computer networks with virus or with some hacking attempts, but he would not attack them by brutal force as he did with Georgia or with Ukraine. Both countries denied accession into NATO by Angela Merkel herself. And that is the crucial difference. Vladimir Putin didn't want expansion of NATO, or better to say, joining of NATO by the former Russia-occupied countries, not because he was afraid that NATO will expand so far to the east that it will attack Moscow. Nobody would do this ever, and Vladimir Putin knows it, but because Vladimir Putin understood that being inside of the alliance protects these countries, and Vladimir Putin wanted these countries to feel unsafe. So from this perspective, accession of Finland into NATO doesn't pose any threat to Russia in a military perspective, but it limits Russia's opportunity to military blackmail Finland. And of course, it's it undermines the position of those who say that NATO is a weak alliance, they can do nothing.
So I wanted to actually then switch gears slightly to look at Belarus and the role of Belarus and how it's changed over the course over the war. And should the EU, and to a lesser extent NATO, try to engage with Belarus more? Or is there any hope to engage with Belarus more? Are we already past that point?
Well, Belarus story is a very sad story, because I'm sorry for trying to develop this story long into the past, but it's impossible to talk seriously about the current events without going back to the past. If we look back to the past, in the year 2020, rigged elections in Belarus, and Alexander Lukashenko has clearly lost the elections, and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has clearly won the elections, and it was clear and obvious for anyone who observed the elections. In any polls which were not rigged, which were observed by independent observers, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya got 70% of votes, more of that, and it was impossible for Alexander Lukashenko to win. So instead of claiming Svetlana Tikhanovskaya as a president-elect and totally switching the internal dynamics of the protests, providing protests with credibility and with legitimacy, the collective West decided to express deep concerns and some threats. So what was the consequence of that? The consequence was that at the late August 2020, as several majors of the cities, including the mayor of one of the biggest cities, Grodno, and some like police officers and chiefs of police stations who were ready theoretically to switch to the side of Tikhanovskaya and give this protest the new momentum, the new impulse, they decided to stick to Lukashenko because it was clear that the protests are not ready to take the power. So as a result of that, we got Belarus, which was completely digested by Vladimir Putin because Vladimir Putin realized he can own Lukashenko, he can send his troops to Belarus, he can like put Belarus under de facto control. We have got a prolongation of the potential front line between Russia and Ukraine by another 800 kilometers, like adding additional 50% of the front line. We have allowed Vladimir Putin in 1.5 years to start his offensive to Kiev from Belarus via Chernobyl exclusion zone. And we have allowed Vladimir Putin to install his nukes in Belarus and to install his troops and to use Belarusian airspace to terrorize Ukraine. So the Western reluctancy and the Western unreadiness to act swiftly and decisively didn't lead to any de-escalation or to some a strategic advantage of the West with the prolonged sanctions effect and draining the regime. No, quite the opposite. It led to strengthening the regime, to hardening the regime, and it led to expansion of the total control territory controlled by Vladimir Putin. So now when we talk about can something happen in Belarus for good, I don't think that now anything can happen in Belarus independently of military defeat of Putin's Russia. I believe that only if Russia will be defeated on the battlefield and its army will be expelled from Ukraine, and it can lead to certain cracks inside of the political structure of the Russian Federation. After that, the protests in Belarus can gain in power once again, can reignite themselves, and can lead to some changes in Belarus, but not until now. Before Russia got bitten, Belarus remains a frozen, cold island under control of two dictators, Putin and Lukashenko.
Sad, but I believe that's true as well. And then just going to my last question, what do these changes mean for the Three Seas region, and what opportunities and obstacles do they pose for the Three Seas countries?
Well, the idea, the core idea of the Three Seas is the regional cooperation, bringing together the countries which are too weak to act alone. If we don't mention Poland, which is already developing into a military and politically regional superpower, the other countries, they are lacking of the scale. The Baltic states, which are between 1.5 and 2 million of population, Czechia and Slovakia, which is under a dozen of million. They cannot have enough military, economic, and demographic momentum to compete against the larger players like Russia or the others. But these countries, they are united by a very unique historical experience of hundreds of years of resistance, hundreds of years of being occupied and fighting against occupation, liberating themselves, fighting for this freedom. They know how to resist the unfreedom, and they know the price of freedom. And independently on the historical tensions and traumata, Like, just think about the traumatic history of relations between Poland and Ukraine.
Right.
Despite of this traumatic history, they managed to overcome their fears. And when we see now that Poland is one of the biggest military suppliers for Ukraine and the biggest receiver of Ukrainian refugees, we see that these historical traumatic experiences have been overcome, and it led to some sort of real union based on values. The values of freedom, the values of security in good sense for their people, the values of resistance. And that makes this regional alliance pretty different compared to like the current role of Germany or France within the EU, which is mostly focused on economic interests and often ignores political responsibility, moral, or like security aspects. So in this Three Seas initiative, we witness the creation of a regional value-based alliance, which has a stronger military component than the EU ever had, and which can theoretically be also a very strong economic player. If we look at the logistic routes within the region, it was the region which always, like since over 1,000 years, was a region with intense economic trade routes. And it is up to now, when we look at all the corridors we built now in Europe, this Three Seas region can be a very successful, strong economic model for its neighbors. So here we have very unique combination of different factors and a vital interest for cooperation. Because if in this region, one country says, "Oh no, I will not do it. I will better go to Moscow to talk to Vladimir Putin." It's impossible to imagine. I can't imagine in, like, let me say, in Europe, when one country leader or prime minister or foreign minister goes to Moscow to play his or her own game. I can't imagine that the prime minister or foreign minister of Lithuania or of Poland or like of Czechia goes separately to Moscow to undermine the Three Seas initiative. That is just impossible, and that makes this alliance strong.
Well, that's great. Well, that's all, unfortunately, we have time for today. There's so many other questions I would like to ask you, but I'll have to wait till you come to Warsaw. So thank you once again, Sergej, and I look forward to seeing you in, well, I think it's what, 2 weeks, 3 weeks till our conference. So we look forward to seeing you at that time.
Thank you so much. It's amazing. Thank you. Have a great day. See you in Warsaw.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.